Right, so welcome to part two of the history of Vale Tudo. So I had a really good response to the first video where we looked at the origins, the first ever Vale Tudo fight, which was back in 1909, and then how that kind of progressed over the years. And we managed to get a look at the first, what I believe is the first ever recorded Vale Tudo fight, which was Carlson Gracie versus Valdemar Santana. So we looked at that in the last video. If you didn't see that, make sure you go back and check it out. So I've been busy training, and just recently, last weekend, I had my own Vale Tudo fight. So for those who don't know what Vale Tudo is it's a Portuguese term that basically means anything goes. I've got it tattooed on my hands right there. And it's sort of the precursor to modern day MMA. So what we see now in the UFC sort of stemmed from these early days of Vale Tudo fights, where there was very limited rules, no gloves. You tended to be no time limit. Sometimes they would have time stipulations. There was no eye gouging, no biting, no kicking in the groin. But apart from that, anything really went. They could strike, they could grapple, they could submit. Sometimes they wore a gi, like a jiu-jitsu gi. Sometimes they didn't. And yeah, so that started sort of 1909 in Brazil was the early days, but it was really through the 20s and the 30s that it really sort of took off. And there were lots of people fighting under these rules. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. So when we think about old school Vale Tudo, we're thinking about the Gracies. But the Gracies didn't start learning until about 1917. So when Maida came over from Japan, and we talked about him last time, he was traveling around, and then he started teaching the Gracie. So it was Carlos Gracie, so Helio's oldest brother. He was kind of the patriarch of the family, and he was the main one, if you like, who was learning from Maeda. There was Carlos, there was George, and they were kind of the main two who were actively fighting. Carlos had a few fights with a guy called Gio Amori. So Gio was another Japanese immigrant who'd come over in the 20s. And I believe the Gracies were actually learning from him as well. So it was their coach, if you like, their instructor. And yeah, a bit distastefully, Carlos challenged him, and they had multiple fights apparently. Lots of these fights would end in draws, by the way, because they would have a time stipulation. So say it's 30 minutes, and if it went to 30 minutes, it would be a draw. And I actually did that for my fight of the weekend, which I won, by the way. We had a 15-minute time limit, and we said if it goes 15 minutes, it will be a draw. But I managed to get the win, 2 minutes and 30 into the fight by stoppage. I landed a few headbutts, and it was really cool to go back and fight those rules. I think it's the first time like an organised Vale Tudo fight has happened in the UK. So big shout out to my opponent David Round, who is a legend in the game himself. So yeah, I'll put a little clip of the fight just here. Go. So back to the Gracies. So again, Carlos back then was like the patriarch of the family, and he was fighting some of the Japanese fighters. Like I say, he had a bit of a rivalry with his apparent coach back then, Gio or George Amori, and but it seems, I mean, and I can't find any videos of these fights. Again, the earliest one we had was the 1955 bout with Carlson, which Carlson is the oldest son of Carlos Gracie, by the way, just so you get an idea of the family tree, because it is a huge, huge family. And then you've got George, that's the sort of next oldest brother. It seems, from what I can find, George, as out of all the brothers, George has the most recorded, not video recorded, but written down that these matches happened. Vale Tudo fights. It seems that George was the real champion, if you like, the real fighter of the family. Yeah, again, I have yet to find any videos of George competing. So all of his fights were from 1930 to 1955, and he had lots of fights in that time. He fought. There was another Japanese coach fighter who came over called Takio Yano, and he had multiple fights with him. But yeah, if anybody has any video footage from back then, any photos, anything like that, please let me know. I would love to see them. But yeah, it seems like out of all the brothers, it was George who was the fighter who was taking on these fights. And they weren't just fighting against the Japanese, they was fighting against, again, we spoke about this last time, fighters from Capoeira, the Luta Livre guys, which was another grappling style in Brazil back then that sort of evolved at the same time as Gracie Jiu-Jitsu or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So yeah, there was lots of rivalry back then. But the sort of guy who's credited, if you like, with being the creator of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is Helio Gracie, their youngest brother. So they kind of get forgotten about, but it was them who was it was Carlos and George, mainly George, who was fighting and having these Vale Tudo fights. So let's jump to Helio Gracie. He had his first fight, which was apparently a Vale Tudo fight in 1932. And he won it by armbar. Now, a lot of his fights that are credited as being Vale Tudo fights, like I've not seen any of his Vale Tudo fights, but there is video evidence of fights in 1951, but there was no striking in them. They just looked like grappling fights. So even though in some places they're credited as being Vale Tudo fights, I believe they're just pure grappling rules fights. So yes, so one of these fights I'm going to show you now. So this is he took on a guy called Kato. Now Kato had come over with Masahiko Kimura from Japan. So in the 50s, there was in Brazil, they were doing like pro wrestling, they was doing jiu-jitsu demonstrations. So yeah, Kimura was kind of the leader of the troop, if you like. He was the big guy, the big champion, and Kato was one of his understudies. So I believe that Helio wanted to fight Kimura, but as a bit of a rite of passage, they said, "No, you got to fight this guy first." So this is the match against Kato.
Kato aplica uma bela queda, levando Helio para o chão. Ao cair no chão, a primeira preocupação de Helio é procurar botar Kato dentro de suas pernas, ou seja, dentro de sua guarda. Mesmo estando por baixo, Helio teria elementos de finalizar o seu adversário. A guarda é uma posição clássica de defesa, que não limita as possibilidades de ataque de quem está por baixo. Observe agora, Helio irá colocar uma mão na gola do kimono de Kato e com a segunda mão ele irá aplicar o seu movimento favorito, o estrangulamento. A eficácia do movimento faz com que Kato perca a consciência quase que imediatamente. O juiz alega que ele não bateu. Helio, vendo que ele não pode estar fugindo por tanto tempo, o afasta.
So as you can see, they're both wearing the traditional judo gis, and judo and jiu-jitsu. So Kimura was actually a black belt in judo. But the terms judo and jiu-jitsu were used interchangeably back then. So yeah, when we call it Brazilian jiu-jitsu, you know, it could have easily been called Brazilian judo. That's just the state of things back then. There was now obviously we see them as very different styles, but back then judo and jiu-jitsu was just two names for the same style. So as you can see, his opponent Kato, very good judo, takes him down, lands on top of him. Helio puts him in the guard, gets a cross choke, and puts him to sleep with a cross choke. Now, there was a bit of controversy with this fight. As you can see on the video, there was under the ring ropes, and apparently the referee was trying to stop him and move him back to the centre to restart it. But Helio didn't let go of the choke, put his opponent unconscious. So then, apparently, Helio was supposed to fight another guy, another member of the troupe, and Kimura said, no, I'll step in. It's time for him to go against the big boys. So, yeah, and there we end up with the famous fight, which is well documented. I'll show you the video now, against Masahiko Kimura. Kimura finishes him with his famous reverse udigarami, the Kimura lock, as it is known. That's why we call it the Kimura these days. So he broke Helio's arm with that. And Helio was a lot smaller than Kimura. Kimura was actually born in 1917, I believe, which is when Helio had only just started training at that point. So there was a big age difference. Kimura was, Helio was obviously older, more experienced, but Kimura was younger. He was a lot bigger, about 50 pounds, maybe more heavier. So, yes, here is the match.
日本の名誉を守るため、木村は2万人の観客の前に立った。ヘリオを投げまくる木村。そして開始後10分、必殺の大外刈りから寝技へ。ついにエリオを捉える。強烈な腕絡みにエリオの骨が鈍い音を立てて折れた。そしてセコンドのタオル投入で勝負は決した。日本柔道がグレイシー柔術に干渉した瞬間である。翌日の新聞は一面で木村の強さを絶賛。こうしてエリオを倒した技、木村ロック。
Yeah, that's the match with the famous Kimura. Again, Helio was much smaller. He was an older gentleman at that time, but he got a lot of respect and stuff for putting it on the line. So, but these fights weren't Vale Tudo fights. Vale Tudo fights were happening all around this time, and obviously the Gracies were massively involved in these Vale Tudo fights, and Helio himself had Vale Tudo fights, but we just don't have any video, or at least I can't find any. So if you can, please let me know. Now, last time we saw a video of Carlson Gracie fighting Valdemar Santana in 1955 in a Vale Tudo fight. So Helio actually fought Valdemar. Valdemar won by a soccer kick to the head. Probably why we don't see the video is maybe the Gracies swept that one under the carpet, so they got rid of that. And then there seems to be a big... There's lots of fights that, happen that we hear about, but there's just no... I just can't find any videos until 1974. We see another fight. So Valdemar Santana pops up again, and he's fighting a guy called Ivan Gomez. Now, from everything I can find, Ivan Gomez at the time is the man. Basically, he is the man. He was having fights against the Gracies, and this is one of his fights against the legend that is Valdemar Santana, which is a fight that he goes on to win. Was Ivan Gomez beating Valdemar Santana back in 1974. So this is all pre-UFC. UFC didn't start till 1993. And this is all sort of before we see all the Gracie challenge matches that are really common that we see in the gyms and stuff that started happening after that. So if anybody's got any videos of any Vale Tudo fights that happened in this period before, sort of between 1955 and 1974, so there's a 20-year period there where we don't see much video evidence, but there is lots of documentation saying, you know, who fought who and who won and stuff like that, and all these rivalries with the Gracies. And you know, it's like this Ivan Gomez. He could grapple, but he'd learned from the Japanese, and he'd learned from almost a different lineage that didn't come directly from the Gracies. So we see these lineages like the Fada Jiu-Jitsu lineage, which is a non-great. It's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu style that is non-Gracie, and I think Ivan Gomez, you know, was from. I think he did train with people who trained with the Gracies, but you know, he'd learned from a different pathway. So, and it's all this stuff we don't really hear about. We hear about Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and that's kind of it, because I think they were the best at marketing themselves. But yeah, I don't want this video to carry on for too long today. So there's going to be a part 3, a part 4. We're going to keep going. So that is it for today's video on the history of Vale Tudo. There's going to be more coming up next. We're going to get deep into the Gracie challenges. We're all set up towards creating the UFC.